evening, everyone, and welcome to the Balie here for everyone sitting surrounding us, but also to those who are watching the live stream. Welcome in a world led by rocket men. Tonight we will discuss nuclear weapons and nuclear strategy in this new geopolitical age. In February, the US and Israel attacked Iran over the supposed immediate nuclear threat. But there have been more developments that we should discuss. The US-Russian nuclear treaty New START has expired. China is doubling its nuclear arsenal. AI is compressing the strategic decision windows. And for Europe, relying on the American nuclear umbrella is not straightforward anymore. This all is to say that the common assumptions that kept nuclear control and deterrence more or less stable since the end of the Cold War are just no longer holding. And that meant that my colleague, Geopolitics editor Senna Velius, thought it was high time to catch up on nuclear strategy and to build some nuclear literacy. So that's what we will be doing tonight. My name is Veronica Baas. I will be moderating. And we will be discussing three big topics. That means that we won't cover all, but we do hope to get some sense of what's happening now in the world. So we will be talking about the logic of nuclear deterrence and control. We will be talking about shifting global security guarantees. And we will try to decipher whether and how we can still read the nuclear escalation ladder. There will also be room for questions at the end, but be aware or take into account in your decision that we are a live stream as well. So we are all sitting here together and I am joined by three experts and I'm very happy to discuss this with them and I will introduce them. First, looking me straight into the eyes, is Dr. Paul van Hoofd, an expert on great power politics and grand strategy and director of the RAND Europe Deterrence Initiative. Welcome. Here I have Lisa Dupuy, a King's College London graduate who reports on nuclear issues and warscapes as an independent journalist for The Correspondent and NRC, and she was a correspondent for NRC in India, just returned home. And also I have here Dr. Tim Sweijs, Director of Research at the Hague Center for Strategic Studies, whose work spans interstate coercion, deterrence, emerging technologies, and the future of warfare. So, more than equipped to discuss this, but I want to start this discussion with where all of this started. So I want to watch an iconic fragment from an interview with the director of the Manhattan Project, Dr. Oppenheimer. Yeah, the destroyer of worlds. So we saw a moment that many describe really as that opening of Pandora's box, and there is a problem, a feature of the world that was not there before, but now it is. And suddenly everyone has to relate and to that very given. Paul, just to start, take us from there to here. So we have this new existential question in the world. How does that shape the logic of how we think of that? Or can you take us?
Yeah. So nuclear weapons, I mean, they're still weapons, right? But what makes them unique, what makes them revolutionary is sort of that they make time and space essentially irrelevant. So the way I always sort of introduce this is to talk about, we've destroyed cities and civilizations. We as in humans have done this throughout history, right? Whether it's Carthage or the Mongol invasion, or even before the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there's the bombing of Japan with conventional weapons. Except those acts of mass violence would take hundreds, thousands of men with a lot of weapons over a longer period of time. Now, with bombing, that amount of time and space and how much you needed to do to kill a lot of people sort of shrank. But with nuclear weapons, it sort of shrank to almost a non-point, right? So within seconds, you would destroy a city like Amsterdam completely, right? To make it just all of us would disappear. That fundamentally changes the way you can think about war, and it also changes the way you think about deterrence, right? So if deterrence is in its essence very easy to understand, right? It's the same as when you see the police in the street or you have the criminal system. If you do something and we catch you, you'll go to prison. Or, or we make it a little bit more difficult for you to do the thing. So in a sense, deterrence has always existed, weapons have always existed, except that with nuclear weapons, sort of from doing nothing to using them, there's almost no volume control in there. You go from 0 to 100 essentially immediately. And that makes our way of having to think about how that fits within our strategy, how we use that to communicate to the adversary, makes it completely different, right? Still, it's sort of an extension to things we already did and we already knew, but it sort of pushes them to the extreme.
Yeah, so Tim, like how we have this new given, like deterrence in an extreme sense, so rather than maybe using it or showing that you're willing to use it, we really don't want to use it, but we do want to use that given to achieve our goals.
Well, if your opponent has a nuclear weapon, then for sure you also want to have a nuclear weapon. And I think there's one additional distinct feature, because I subscribe to everything that Paul said. But with the arrival of nuclear weapons, we, mankind, for the first time in history, have the possibility to actually blow up the entire planet. And that does take more than one nuclear bomb. But if you have a nuclear bomb, I want to have a nuclear bomb. Because if you have a nuclear bomb, you can attack me. I also want to have a nuclear bomb. So I want to make sure that I can also attack you. And there is the notion of deterrence, because I deter you from attacking me because you know that I can attack you back. And there's not then one nuclear weapon doesn't suffice. So this introduces an arms race. We need more weapons, more weapons, more weapons, until we reach a level in which we have a credible second strike capability, which means that if the Soviet Union, way back when, was to attack the US would still have the possibility to strike back. And that in turn introduced the notion of mutual assured destruction. Because we both know that we can destroy one another, we have a deterrence relationship. And that in itself is the inevitable, well, we're going to talk about that, but logic of nuclear weapons and logic of deterrence. And this is also why nuclear powers, once they have nuclear weapons, are not very likely to disarm and do away with their nuclear weapons, because they wouldn't be able to deter their opponent.
And can I quickly add, I really like the way that you phrased saying the introduction or the invention of nuclear weapons introduced a new facet of how the world is. And both Paul and Tim do a great job now of introducing a lot of the jargon and a lot of the thinking that comes in now that these nuclear weapons are here. For people that don't do a lot of that thinking around nuclear weapons in their daily lives, I get this question very often, or I used to get it way more, say 5 years ago, 10 years ago, when I started my degree. People would say, but the nuclear weapons, they don't get used, right? That is what a lot of these strategic logics are geared towards. So what did they really change? And I always start by saying, well, they're a way of wielding and yielding power without even having that weapon be actually used. And the first place where the first sort of like inkling of that power comes into play, very easy, look at the UN, are 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. They are nuclear weapons state. They get to lord it over everybody. They get to vote it or veto whatever resolution they want. That's where their power already starts. We're not even talking about a warscape or an escalation ladder. These are all things that we'll come to talk about. But that is the facet that they introduce.
Yeah, so there is this enormous amount of power that is vested in these weapons, but there is also this logic of deterrence and then control and trying to get that mutual insured destructions, which kind of is supposed to lead to some kind of stability.
Yeah.
But is there that the only, like Tim mentioned it already, like the US versus the Soviet Union, that really is the model that we've all come to know, and still the most fundamental, sitting here in Amsterdam. Yeah, exactly. But that's where I want to go. Like, are there different kind of logics?
Well, deterrence comes into play for, I think, most nuclear weapons states. It's
the given.
It's the given. Yeah, it's part of their power. Actually, they've introduced a new way of thinking about how we yield power. But there are different arenas in which different applications of the deterrence make a different kind of sense, I think. So between the US and the former USSR, or the US and the USSR at the time, there's an ocean between them. Between India and Pakistan, there is a contested border between them. There's China that became a nuclear power state within the context of the Cold War, but then that has its own relationships with India and Pakistan. So there are sort of like different kinds of boxes, basically, like view boxes that you could put on the globe.
And to add one thing, the introduction of nuclear weapons doesn't mean that wars are no longer fought, even between nuclear powers. There's such a thing that is called the stability-instability paradox, which essentially means that you have nuclear powers who can't attack each other with nuclear means, but they are able to fight at a lower level. And you mentioned India and Pakistan, which triggered the thought. They are able to fight wars as long as they don't escalate further. So there is a notion of deterrence at this higher level, but it doesn't mean that we can't see lower level conflict even between nuclear powers.
So it's sort of inherent to... So a lot of weapons can do deterrence, right? They're all about inflicting costs. I'm going to make it very painful for you if you do the thing that I don't want you to do. But nuclear weapons are so destructive that we wouldn't believe that we're going to do it. And that's what that creates this very odd situation that maybe actually we can do certain levels of conflict, including, large-scale conventional war, potentially, or at least with India and Pakistan already a few times.
Yeah, so India, they have such high belief in the stability of the that
they won't go over a certain threshold, so they're much more comfortable below that threshold. But that also gets you to another problem when you talk about, the terms of like escalation control. All of that is not, it's actually, there's a lot of jargon, but it's not that difficult to get. It's precisely because it's such a jump up from 0 to 100 that you start building in things that are in between. So you want to have you have the ability to have a conventional war, and you have your so-called tactical or non-strategic nuclear weapons, because you're basically going, I don't want to go to 100, but I'm going to go to 20 or 40 or 50, just so you know that after that, the only thing that's left is 100, and that's when, incredibly bad things happen for both of us. But it sort of induces a very kind of weird situation where you're still investing in other kinds of weapons, even though theoretically you have a weapon that should make all war sort of unproductive.
So the competition continues, and these escalation ladders, which we're going to talk about, but the logic is that you could start out with using a tactical nuclear weapon in a localized area to show that you're actually serious and are willing to go further.
Yeah, but just how do we square that? Like a tactical nuclear weapon where we also have this 0-100 logic. Like, isn't it weird that we've started talking about isn't it all tactics or none of it?
Well, the notion of a tactical nuclear weapon is that you wouldn't destroy the entire country of your opponent. You would use a tactical nuclear weapon in a local environment, which shows that you're willing to blow up a really small territory. But you're willing to cross that nuclear threshold, which in effect is intended to scare your opponent in backing down. And this is why, you said it very well, kind of hard to believe that you're going to go destroy the entire country of your opponent at once. And certainly in the case that in which there's a notion of mutual assured destruction where your opponent can hit back. And this is why you have this very counterproductive, if you like, nuclear arms race dynamics in which you say, well, I have 100 nuclear weapons. Well, maybe I should have 200, but if I have 200, my opponent may have 300, so let's go higher and higher. But if I only have strategic weapons to destroy the country, maybe we should have some smaller tactical nuclear weapons in order to convince him that we're willing and able to deploy them. And so in deterrence, there's the 3 C's, right? You need capability, you need to actually be able to do it. You need credibility, which means you need to have the political will to do it. And you have the communication. You need to be able to convey that you actually have the capability and the willingness to do so. And these 3 C's are always in a very tense relationship with one another, because even if you have the capability, are you willing to use them? And even if you are willing to use them, how are you going to communicate that to your opponent? Now, we've seen over the past few years, especially during the first 2 years after the large-scale conventional invasion of Ukraine, after February 2022, that the Russians were quite good at signaling that they were willing to escalate. And we, having unlearned, if you like, the nuclear grammar, having stopped studying the Russians, we were really scared. We thought they were actually going to do it. So when the Russians started threatening, we thought, let's be very careful. And now after 4 years, we see, well, it's more than 4 years now, right? Almost 4.5. We see that the Russians are also bluffing and that we shouldn't always play into their hand. But it's a very pernicious dynamic
because we hear saying there is actually also in the war that Russia is waging still this nuclear stability. But what is necessary for nuclear stability?
Well, stability is, again, so there's another problem to introduce into, because so the problems are not, I think, hard to grasp.
I have the inkling that they will keep coming.
And there's problems within problems within problems. But the other problem is also the next level to really understand, or next issue to really understand, is that theoretically, if we both have nuclear weapons, we deter each other, we should be kind of done, right? But I don't like to be vulnerable. Like, if we were both vulnerable, we're sort of done, right? There's no win for either of us. So I'm going to think about ways in which I can be a little bit less vulnerable. And I can be a little bit less vulnerable if maybe I stop you from launching. So, if I can stop your president or prime minister from giving the command, or maybe I can stop your satellites from seeing that I've launched, and maybe I can destroy your arsenal. I can, hit where they're located. I can hit where if they're on aircraft, I can destroy those aircraft, maybe the submarines, maybe the silos. And then if I have ballistic missile defense, whatever comes back at me, I can also still stop. And even if it doesn't stop everything, because sometimes it doesn't really mean that you destroy an entire country. If we're talking about a European country, most of it would be gone. But if you're a continental-sized state like the United States, with multiple cities with millions of people, then, maybe, and if you're Russia or China, maybe you could survive as a country, even if you, and I know this sounds insane to anybody who's hasn't been forced to think about this, but if you lose 3, 4, 5 cities and you lose 10 million people, if you have 340 million people, your country survives, right? So there's always that incentive to kind of do damage limitation, to kind of make it a little bit less destructive. But if we both do this, well, they're both getting a bit nervous, because then I'm going to go, okay, I need a better missile. I need a more quiet submarine. I need another launcher. I need more missiles in general, because the more missiles I have, the harder it is for you to destroy them. And that's instability. So stability is essentially when neither of us thinks we can sort of win with this.
Yeah. So we have the instability that is the stability and the maybe increasing instability, but there's also the adhering to the logic and therefore being predictable. But there is also maybe an option that states are not that predictable anymore.
Well, yes, yeah. I think that is a question that comes up in a lot of international relations questions, right? How rational is a head of state, or how rational does a state system build towards certain decisions? But yeah, we would all really like to think that, especially if there's a nuclear weapon sort of like that's at the extreme end of the axis that we're working towards. The decisions between that are as logical as possible. But it's very hard to know if actors are rational, and it's also very hard to know if everybody ascribes to the same logic all of the time.
Yeah, and do you think that like nuclear logic is like an extension of regular deterrence or regular warfare? Like we were saying, U.S. foreign policy has become way less predictable. Does that automatically mean that its nuclear policy is also less predictable, or should we think in a different category?
I do think it's becoming less predictable, but I wanted to introduce one more theoretical fundamental.
Yeah, great.
Because it will also allow us to link it to arms control. So stability, we're talking about stability, and it hinges on two things: deterrence stability and crisis stability. And the deterrence stability essentially means that, do I have enough confidence that I can reliably have a second strike capability towards my opponent? And so you try to stabilize that and saying, well, I have an arsenal of 300 or an arsenal of 5,000 missiles, and then it's enough.
Geographically spread it out. And
yes, and for all the reasons, right, you have a triad. So you can hit your opponent in various ways. There are submarines roaming the oceans, and whenever your home country is hit, the submarine commander can launch a missile. So there is a credible second strike capability. But then there's the notion of crisis stability, which means in a crisis, will I not be afraid that my opponent takes out my various launch capabilities? And then you introduce a use them or lose them dynamic, which may create an incentive to strike first because you think your opponent is going to hit you. That crisis stability notion is not only because of deliberate use, but can also be of inadvertent escalation, because you think your opponent may do something, even though your opponent wasn't necessarily intending to do so. And this is why in a deterrence relationship, you need to create paradoxically, but a relation in which you understand one another and agree that you can monitor one another in order to introduce that notion of predictability and certainty, as you just said. And that is the bridge to arms control, in which even nuclear powers, because they know they don't want to blow up the entire Earth, nor have their own nations destroyed, say, let's agree that we cap the number of missiles that we have, that we are allowed to monitor one another, and that we can have on-site inspections. For a very long time, we had a number of these regimes, part of the Cold War arms control architecture. And the disconcerting, the worrying thing now is that these arms control treaties have now all expired. So there is no longer on-site inspections. There are no longer caps. Nuclear powers are modernizing and expanding their arsenal and their delivery vehicles, which we will talk about. But that really is a source of concern, because the arms control efforts to introduce predictability in the deterrence relationship is gone.
Yeah, and I can imagine that as regular foreign relations are becoming more unpredictable, it's also easier to get into that starting first.
What's really interesting is that these nuclear weapons are such an extreme end, basically, of international relations. It's everybody sort of like playing their top game. They also serve as a litmus test to understand how these players see the current state of the world. So the fact that earlier this year, the US and Russia let die off the New START treaty that did include very far-reaching verification methods. It meant that inspectors from both countries had contact with each other. They were able to double check on each other's, stockpiles, things like that. The fact that both countries were, I don't know if they were happy, but in any case, have let that
willing.
They were willing, exactly. They were willing to let it expire, which means that all of that control falls away. It says something about how they see the rest of the security environment, and then the choices that they make in response to that. It's not to say, holy shoot, like we're not liking each other at all, and we're actually really on the brink of sort of like at each other's throats. We need to restrain ourselves so that we can restrain you, right, and each other. No, what they're saying is, well, you know what, F you, I don't trust you actually. I'm gonna maybe build more. And yeah, so that's, it's a litmus test. It helps you read the room.
Yeah, and it's sort of an interesting one with the new START treaty expiring this year, is that Russia and the US, despite all the things clearly happening in the White House, clearly happening in Kremlin, still they're going to behave as if the treaty works, or at least they're going to mostly behave like that. Probably they're going to start cheating at the edges. Right?
So they will still send inspection troops?
Well, not inspections, but at the same time, there's also enough stuff in space that can monitor whether you're doing something really off-key.
They will keep eyes on each other.
But that's it. But then getting back to your question on how rational is it? So it's a weird situation, right? A lot of it can be very quote unquote rational, but it also is in an environment of uncertainty where the consequences are so drastic. So it's both the reason that deterrence really sort of seems to work, because it's very hard to mentally, even for like the experts, even for people who have the war games, to really think through and to feel like 1-2 steps ahead, that this doesn't disintegrate into something that's very hard to grasp. And at the same time, that also means that you're sort of you're still always paranoid, right? Are you sure that the new missile can't do this thing? Are you sure that their new cyber weapon can't get into your communication system? So it's very unstandable. Like, none of it's sort of abstract things that people, if you were all put in this situation, you would start behaving like this probably pretty quickly. But it is a very extreme situation to be in.
And let's add one more contextual factor to the logic. Why did they let this expire? Russia has an enormous stockpile of nuclear weapons and compensates for its conventional weakness with its nuclear weapons. The Americans, we no longer live in a bipolar world. The Americans want to get the Chinese in and start negotiating caps on Chinese nuclear capabilities. But the Chinese, who had a fairly modest stockpile of nuclear weapons, have doubled or tripled, I would say doubled, their nuclear weapon stockpile from 250 to 500, 600, maybe even, planning to get it up over to 1,000, perhaps even 1,500, because they think they are gaining in conventional strength, but they're still the underdog when it comes to nuclear weapons vis-a-vis the US.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, we no longer have a bipolar system in which two powers can come to an agreement, but there's now a third body, which introduces new problems into the equation.
Yeah, well, that's exactly where I want to go, the shifting in the global power. But I first want to look at another fragment, because we've just established that deterrence requires rationality and predictability and time. And Stanley Kubrick in 1946, 64, had his own intuitions about how that might go. So let's look at a fragment from Dr. Strangelove.
Mr. President, there are 1 or 2 points I'd like to make, if I may. Go ahead, General. 1. Our hopes for recalling the 843rd bomb wing are quickly being reduced to a very low order of probability. 2. In less than 15 minutes from now, the Ruskies will be making radar contact with the planes. 3. When they do, they are going to go absolutely ape, and they're going to strike President, but nevertheless distinguishable post-war environments. One where you got 20 million people killed, and the other where you got 150 million people killed.
You're talking about mass murder, General, not war.
Mr. President, I'm not saying we wouldn't get our hair mussed, but I do say no more than 10 to 20 million killed, tops, depending on the Brits.
I will not go down in history as the greatest mass murderer since Adolf Hitler.
Perhaps it might be better, Mr. President, if you were more concerned with the American people than with your image in the history books.
General Turgison, I think I've heard quite sufficient from you. Thank you very much.
Mr. President, they have the ambassador waiting upstairs.
Oh, good. Any difficulty?
They say he's having a fit about that squad of MPs.
Yeah, well, that can't be helped. Have him brought down here straight away.
Yes, sir.
Is that the Russian ambassador? Am I to understand the Russian ambassador is the admitted entrance to the war room?
That is correct. He is here on my orders.
I don't know exactly how to put this, sir, but are you aware of what a serious breach of security that would be? I mean, you'd see everything. You'd see the big board.
That is precisely the idea, General. That is precisely the idea.
Saints, get Premier Kissoff on the hotline.
Yeah. How far are we from this situation?
We're pretty far off.
Okay.
Well, sort of good news, bad news. The bad news was that this movie was pretty accurate representation of the 50s and early 60s. The good news is that there's a lot of safeguards in place now to prevent those kind of things. But in the 50s and 60s, we were lucky that this didn't happen. So that's maybe a bit more good news is that there's a lot of studies on people who actually were in charge on the war games they ran, and they were highly unlikely to use nuclear weapons. So the people who actually made the decisions were very reticent to actually use them, even in just a game situation. So it's a little bit of good news.
Good. Yeah, so Tim already introduced China to the conversation. So the US and Russia still have the vast majority of nuclear weapon, but China is increasing. So, Paul, do you think that we are moving towards a three-polar equilibrium?
We're not in equilibrium, but we have moved to a three-polar system in the sense that all the US and Russian arsenals are still vastly bigger than the Chinese arsenals, but they're behaved.
Just how much bigger?
So we have both the US and Russia have 1,700 strategic warheads deployed, and then about 3,500 in undeployed, which they could upload on the missiles, but which the START treaty prevented them from doing.
Well, that's expired now.
Yeah, so that's 1,700 or so, pretty much at the ready, catastrophic effects. The Chinese, as Tim said, have about had 300, and now have about 600 are the estimates. So that's still quite a bit off, and they don't have that extra upload capacity, so the extra warheads that they can put on missiles. But the way that the US is behaving, and that I think implicitly Russia is behaving, shows that they're not just reacting to each other. So with the US, that's very noticeable, but also with Russia. I think Russia is losing, what is essentially gives it the best claim to great power status, which is to be equal to the US on the nuclear domain. So it's losing that kind of status. And for the US, which is trying to deter what they call the two-peer problem, so where it had to deter just Soviet Union or Russia, now it's deterring Russia, China, and as a lesser case, North Korea, feels that it needs maybe it needs certainly a qualitatively better arsenal and a bigger arsenal. And we've already seen effects, right? So with the START treaty, the US doesn't want to negotiate unless China's involved. Russia doesn't really want to start involving China because that means it sort of loses status. China's like, why are we even talking to us? Because we don't have that kind of arsenal. So there you see it. Also, in the first Trump administration, about 7 years ago, you had the collapse of the INF Treaty, which is another example of this happening. There was a certain, shorter mid-range missiles set up during the Cold War, in the later stage of the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. But because the US in Asia, when competing with China, wants exactly those kind of missiles because China has them, and China was not part of the agreement, and the Russians were cheating anyway, So then the US was like, we don't want to be part of this. So in that sense, just simply, even though the Chinese arsenal is still relatively small, manageable, but just its presence is already is reconfiguring the calculations that they're all making, and is therefore changing their behavior, and therefore is already changing the behavior of all the other states around it.
Yeah, because why is China or
Well, I just wanted to give a quick aside. Outside of those three countries,
Yeah.
I think we safely assume all of the 9 nuclear weapon states, which is like, oh yeah, we agree on 9. All of the 9 nuclear weapon states are modernizing, right? And then a fair chunk of them are looking at getting bigger stockpiles, including France. We'll speak about that later, I'm sure. So we're definitely in a space of time where those states that have a nuclear weapon, that already have a nuclear weapon, are looking to have a qualitatively better arsenal or a bigger one.
Like better missiles and stuff.
Let's
Let's
illustrate that
weird.
a bit, right? So they're expanding their arsenals. They're investing in various yields from tactical to strategic. And they're also building new delivery vehicles, both MIRVs and MARVs. So you're going to imagine that you put nuclear weapons on a bus, on a rocket. And then you have MIRV, multiple independently re-entry vehicles, and MARVs that can maneuver when they go down. So it becomes much harder to shoot them down. And then you also see a shift from liquid fuel to solid fuel, which means that they can be launched much quicker, much faster. And this is a development that you essentially see across the board. And so these are just, well, technological developments, but also geopolitical developments. But if you tie them to the broader uncertainty and the resurgence of great power competition and the various wars that are ongoing, I agree that this is not the 1950s, but I have been much more concerned now than I was, let's say, 10 years ago.
Yeah, I think, Paul, now it's time for the booby-trapped house.
Right.
Really
So the metaphor that I've started using is that you're essentially, during the Cold War, you could already think of this as a house filled with booby traps, but mostly just 2 people walking through it. And the booby traps were big, right? The escalation would go very quickly to disaster consequences. Now the house has about 9 people walking around in it, and there are more booby traps. So none of those booby traps by themselves, none of the ways in which, the pathway to which we get to very bad things, none of them by itself is unsolvable, right? I'm not trying to get everybody sort of paralyzed with fear either. The problem is just that the pathways are multiplying, and therefore all of them can get you to a very bad result, and the pathways also sort of interact. So maybe the lines are sort of, one booby trap sort of connected to the next one, even though by themselves they're all still manageable.
Yeah. So, Lisa, you already said like the smaller nuclear states are also want to proliferate their arsenal, and you said like and the introduction of China, even if it's still a smaller, has changed that interaction. So does that mean that these nuclear countries like Iran and North Korea, but also Israel, like when they have to relate to not just the US and Russia anymore, but to another bigger power, how does that influence their?
Yeah, so Iran is not a nuclear power. There is currently a war being waged, apparently to make it not so, but in any case, over many years, nothing has indicated that they've actually built the bomb with whatever technologies they have managed to develop. But there are, you're right, all in all, there's a few smaller nuclear weapon states, and there are states that could get a nuclear weapon if they decided that the current security state in the world is such that they want their own guarantee.
And what I find worrying in that respect is, if you go to South Korea, if you go to Australia, even if you go to Japan, there's nowadays an actual discussion about acquiring a nuclear capability, even though they would prefer nuclear latency, another jargon term, but that you have the capability to very quickly build a breakout bomb, but that is part of the actual discussion shows how serious these countries take this and how worried they are. And so the outcome, amongst others, of the war waged by the US and Israel against Iran, I mean, if the Iranian regime survives, what would you advise if you would be the national security advisor? Well, Kim Jong-un has the answer. He says, I'm a nuclear power now. They're not going to, it's very unlikely that they're going to attack me. So there is let me use the word again, a very pernicious logic driving nuclear proliferation, which also now, with the growing uncertainty about the US extended security or extended deterrence security guarantee for us Europeans, is also leading to discussions in Europe as to how can we deter Russia. Yeah. And so President Macron's statement about opening up widening the French nuclear umbrella towards its European allies, in combination with discussions of how can we beef up our conventional strength, all can be explained through that logic that if the Americans no longer are willing to extend their nuclear umbrella over us, then we need to find another way to deter Russia.
Yeah, because...
Sorry.
Yeah, maybe you can incorporate the question as well in the answer. Like, so do those... the US is obviously returning or turning its back or saying that troops are taking back from Germany, but does that immediately get holes in that nuclear umbrella in Europe?
Yes. Yes. The simple answer is yes. And then to also take a step back is we got very used to the US playing this role, right? But if you think about it, and I've written about this, it's a very bizarre situation that we had the whole nuclear era started by the US on the other side of the Atlantic and the other side of the Pacific going, look, we're not just deterring you from attacks on us, because actually we know that the Soviets are not going to attack us directly, but we're going to also stop you from aggression against our friends in Europe and Asia. Did the US, did they start doing this in the late 40s, 50s, 60s? Did they start doing this because they were so, so benign, so good? Well, there was a very calculated reason in there as well, because there was a high chance that West Germany, Italy, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Norway, Switzerland, a whole list of countries were at least all either going pretty fast or at least putting together quite a few things to maybe have a nuclear weapon. And then you could have had a few dozen nuclear weapons by now. So the whole
by taking them under their wing, they also make sure that
so the
they
whole
couldn't...
system, exactly, the whole system that we're used to for the last 80 years, which is now rapidly deteriorating, was built on that, right? And that's also why you had so many American troops in Europe, because we get back to that one of those first problems. How are you really going to believe I'm going to use nuclear weapons? Well, if 500,000 American soldiers go up in flames, probably you're going to escalate. So now that is in various ways deteriorating. It's deteriorating because the pressure from a rising China and other nuclear powers, and it's deteriorating because the US is sort of doesn't really want, or at least there's a large group within the US that doesn't really want to do this anymore. And then the pressure to proliferate, or to acquire nuclear weapons, has increased. Now, I don't want to just terrify everyone again, so I'll temper it slightly by saying that to build a nuclear weapon now in some ways is harder than it used to be. Not the technology or not the knowledge per se, but you need to get the uranium, you need to enrich the uranium, you need to weaponize the uranium, then you need to have a good missile, then you need to have actually quite a few of them, then you need to be able to protect that thing in some way, either by hiding it or putting it in a mountain or driving it around. You need to have some kind of radar or satellites to kind of monitor where you want to shoot it at. Anyway, it's a bunch of things you have to figure out, and you have to figure all of them out. And you can see if you don't figure out a lot of these things at once, like Iran, and you enrich your uranium to 60%, which is too much for civilian use, and it's close enough to a bomb, but it's not a bomb yet, then you're in trouble. So we're getting a situation where a lot of states are likely to start thinking about how they can put a lot of things very close to flipping those switches, which creates a more unstable world by itself, right? Because we're all going, wait, are you going to, you're not doing it yet, but you could, and you, right?
It's
so
booby traps.
that's sort of what we have to think about. And that's the booby traps.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, because we have in Europe Great Britain and France, but France is the only one that really has all those capabilities by themselves. So that speech of Macron, how much of a change is it? And can you maybe very briefly summarize what he said?
Yes, so this was March of this year, I believe. Emmanuel Macron stood in front of some of French nuclear arsenal's finest elements at their submarine base and held a very French speech, dissecting once again the very French nuclear doctrine. France developed its own nuclear weapon, very much wanting to and understanding that it would be their sort of like vanguard for their own independence. Again, looking at the power play, I always think about, France did not join a bunch of American interventionist wars against terrorism, where the UK did. There's a very okay. We must say my last name is Dupuis. This is draw your conclusions. But
I used to have the picture of the goal behind me. So.
Okay, great. Okay, well, so there is a very sort of like clearly defined sort of like independent streak in France's nuclear doctrine. And they have before said, when we trigger the nuclear switch, it'll be for French interests. And they have not previously made these umbrella guarantees to say to other European countries or other allies in the world, if you are attacked to a degree that would warrant a nuclear response, I can do that for you.
But the French were, on the one hand side, just very focused on their own interests, and on the other hand, the rest of Europe was covered by the American umbrella. So there was also not a lack of loyalty there.
But the understanding would always be that the US decides when to deploy for the rest of Europe, and France decides when to deploy for France. And so Macron then in March of this year said, well, we are looking into changing that. And other than that, we're also looking into, is there a way to draw in non-nuclear state neighbors? The Netherlands are one of them, Germany is one of them, to cooperate. Do we do joint training exercises where your conventional forces, get to train alongside? So that is a clear change in the posture of France and the way that they're willing to talk about the use of their nuclear weapons in place of a European ally being attacked. My slight caveat there is to say, well, we're a Europe with no borders, and we all, there's lots of French in the Netherlands. If the Netherlands were to be hit by a nuclear Russian weapon, that's very close to France. So I think it would have been not outside of the realm of the previous logic that France would have then stepped in as well.
Yeah, but so the question really hinges on, do the enemies of France and the enemies of the allies of France believe in the deterrence, right?
Yeah. We're not there yet.
Yeah.
No, but it's a first step in a longer process, and that extended deterrence logic, which may have been unbelievable if the Americans have their own continent. I mean, I think that logic it works better if it's France on its own continent. France has a much smaller nuclear weapon arsenal, an entirely different posture. So, I mean, a lot of water needs to flow to the Seine or to the Rhine before this becomes a reality. But I think it marks a significant step, and it's actually a step, right? I mean, they are now starting to collaborate. They're starting to participate in joint exercises. Maybe they will explore ways in which European allies will participate in carrying around French nuclear weapons, or having French nuclear weapons stationed at Dassault. But that's farther ahead. But why is this not trivial? Because if the Americans were to withdraw both their troops and their security guarantee, we need to start thinking about how we are going to defend and deter Russia.
Well, maybe before even.
Exactly.
So there's not a
yeah.
gap.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then the other non-trivial point here is, look, we started out by saying, Julissa, that the P5 in the United Nations Security Council are all nuclear powers. We observe that there is a competition going on in which nuclear powers are modernizing and expanding their arsenals. If we want to have some sort of influence in attempts to curb this, to reintroduce arms control efforts, we want to have a seat at the table. We can only have a seat at the table if we are credible players in that field. So, again, a very paradoxical logic, but in order to control it, in order to introduce confidence-building measures and curb it and reduce the risk, we first need to strengthen our own posture in that.
Are we?
Yeah, no, the speech was very relevant. You'd sort of have to know a bit what the French were saying before. That's a bit why it got a little bit lost in communication, lost in translation. But if you know what the French said before for decades, then this were all departures, right? So the integration of allies, the joint exercises, mentioning the conventional deterrence part of it, so through deep precision strike and so on, sort of advanced conventional weapons, all stuff that's unusual for the French. So then him putting it in the speech, given the context, very relevant. Now, is that enough? Well, we don't really have alternatives. All the other weapons won't really be there in sufficient numbers anytime soon. On the other hand, the Americans can't really pull back, even if they want to, pull back too quickly. But that does leave huge gaps in there. And the problem is not that the French deterrent couldn't be credible for the rest of Europe, is that it will take some time, right? You just need to build the logic of this, the habit of it. Because what I tell a lot of critics is that the US was not credible immediately either. And arguably, the US was never credible even until the end of the Cold War, because allies were constantly thinking the US is either going to decouple, so sort of remove itself from Europe, or during the Cold War, it's going to have a nuclear war, but it's going to keep it in Europe, right? And that's bad for if you're in Europe, that's kind of bad, right?
Yeah.
So what the French are doing is different, and everybody sort of has the expectation that they should copy, sort of find, replace what the US is doing, and that's just not realistic. And by that metric, you're always going to fail. But that's why we sort of need to change our mind, and we need to think more about what the Russians actually don't want us to do, and do those things. Because some of this is, because that's just to kind of make another little, there's a bit of a distinction here, because one part of this is reassurance. Do your friends and allies sort of feel comfortable, and do they feel secure? That's good. Versus, do we want to make sure that the Russians are actually scared? And something that might scare the Russians might not necessarily reassure ourselves, and vice versa, something that reassures us might not scare the Russians. So we have to think a bit more about the things that the Russians would be very nervous about, and then start doing those things.
Yeah, so that's relearning that nuclear grammar that
correct.
Tim said in the beginning. Yeah.
And actually, I think from that point of view of understanding publicly, right, the public understanding nuclear grammar, I think a speech like Macron is also a departure. We've not spoken about these things in a long time so publicly and so outwardly, I think, in a lot of European politics. I do want to say, it's very understandable that we're reaching for deterrence, right? Because it's also being taken away from us. I think you make a very good point to say, you know, our American extended deterrence that we have felt comfortable in for so long, it's the result of 80 years of building that. And I understand that it leaves us vulnerable, and it feels like there is a very critical point in the world. And you want to scurry to whatever feels safe. But sometimes, if I also have an analogy that's sort of like the pot of fissile material. You can choose which way to stir the pot. If we all decided to stir it sort of like counterclockwise, we might be rebuilding a regime of weapons control that makes everybody feel at least, you know, a little bit more comfortable. At the moment, I think we're all stirring it the other way. And it's likely that more people are trying to get their hand on the ladle and make it go faster the other way. Yeah. And for me, as a journalist, I love this discussion. Like, I've not, you know, I've not gotten to have them as often as I was when I was a student. But for a general public, I think it's very important to understand that stirring, whichever clockwise we're going, that is a policy decision, right? That is what politicians decide for you. And yeah.
We need more knowledge, because you also need, I want the public to be involved.
Yes,
I need them to ask better
yeah.
questions, not just to be for or against it. I need them to ask better questions, because it's too important.
Exactly, not be for or against per se.
And that's why
yeah.
I keep saying, like, the logic of it, it gets into some kind of nuances and technicalities at some point, but it's not that hard to follow, right? You get the principles, and if we all get the principles a bit better, we can ask better questions. Because I've testified that's the more American way of doing it. I've given comments in in Parliament at the Council on Foreign Relations, and just the questions from parliamentarians were not great. Not because they weren't smart, not because they don't care. It's just because the overall knowledge level is too low, and that's a problem, right? If they want to be against this and against deterrence, fine, but I need a more convincing argument than exists.
For Dutch people that are in the audience or in the live stream, I think it's this week or maybe last week, but the Groene Amsterdammer carried an article by Koen van de Ven, who is a great journalist, who found that the current cabinet in their memorandum of coalition... Thank you. In their coalition agreement, there's one sentence on nuclear weapons, and this time it says that the Netherlands' position is constructive towards the development or the strengthening of a European nuclear deterrent.
Yeah. But that
the Netherlands
one
for
sentence
decades,
is
the
already...
Netherlands is a middle power. It is actually a quite well-regarded middle power when it comes to non-proliferation, when it comes to that regime of trying to contain the spread of nuclear weapons in the world. For decades, the Netherlands said we're actually striving for a nuclear weapon-free world, or we're striving to have a role in disarmament. That was the one sentence. That is a change. It's really weird, nuclear weapons, we don't want to use them. So words actually matter very, very much. They're like, weirdly, the one thing that makes a decision there. And so, yes, yeah, I don't need people to be for or against, but it would be good if there was...
It's time to raise the nuclear IQ.
Yeah.
That's what we're doing.
That's what we're doing, yeah.
Yeah.
So
Sorry if that was a tangent.
Yeah. So before we go to the change in technology and how to read that escalation letter, I wanted to briefly go to more middle powers that are grabbing the ladle, as you say it, maybe to stir it in a different direction, because I really want to say a few things, or ask you a few things about the war against Iran, and also about the fact that it happened during what was supposed to be negotiations about reaching some kind of agreement of how to deal with that enrichment and how far they could go or not. So what is the consequence of that? How does that influence the logic of how we think of proliferation? Like, in a way, will it encourage middle powers to proliferate, or will it deter them even more because you can't even negotiate your way out of it? You will just be bombed anyway.
Well, let's first establish that the war hasn't ended yet.
Definitely.
And so I think a lot will also hinge on the actual war's outcome. But thus far, I would argue that Iran has shown that even though it has been very vulnerable to a barrage of bombardments, it is also able to strike out, close off the Strait of Hormuz, and hit many of its neighboring countries. Whereas after, how long are we in now? 6 weeks or so?
Last week of February.
Yeah.
So.
With a ceasefire, well, so even longer, the regime is still there, and it hasn't been destroyed. So that is one theater. Another theater is, of course, Ukraine. Ukraine, that after 4.5 years of war, is still able, or almost 4.5, to put up a fight and defend itself against an, on paper, much stronger great power with nuclear weapons. were they to survive, I would think that there's two avenues. One, you can have conventional means and stronger conventional means to defend yourself. But two, the ultimate guarantee, of course, is in order to not be attacked at such a scale, is to have nuclear weapons. So I think this is driving a logic of nuclear proliferation in which middle powers, small and middle powers across the globe are actually eyeing it, as we already alluded to a couple of minutes ago. Will it be as difficult as you just described, Paul? I mean, that's definitely true for Iran. They've had at least over the past 40 years, at various moments in various periods, they tried to enrich uranium, develop a bomb, and then they stopped it, and then they started again. I would think that for highly advanced, technologically advanced countries, such as South Korea, such as Japan, such as Australia, such as Germany, it would be less of a problem. I think they could go nuclear much faster. However, before you have this entire machinery in place, including the command and control infrastructure, that's not something that's going to happen overnight. And during that period of transition, while they're going nuclear, you bet there's going to be instability, because there's going to be neighboring countries who are going to hit them before they have that nuclear bomb.
So it's going to vary. So it's harder to say like sort of a general sort of statement. You know, in the next 10 years, we will see.
Do you fear a new wave of
yes, but
proliferation?
not, not this year, not next year, and it's sort of very contingent on how things end up. So South Korea could go very fast, and Japan as well. But South Korea also has a lot of other things in place because they already have the conventional weapons to have a very precise targeting campaign against North Korea. So they have a lot of, all those bits of infrastructure in place. So it's less for them. It would be going, doing the uranium and the
on
bomb.
A nuclear head.
That would be the only part that's really stopping them from, and everything else in place. Japan would get there very quick, but others wouldn't, right? Germany could, but it would have to it doesn't have the conventional strike complex in place. It doesn't have the ISR yet. So these are already adding few years left and right, and that could also be solved at the same time.
Apart from the cultural thing, even I don't.
Yeah,
see it
and the cultural
right.
thing as well. South Korea is already ready in many ways conceptually for this. And then does that trigger a proliferation wave? That's also a different kind of discussion, right? Like if one state gets it, that makes it more likely that the next state gets it. Maybe, but for instance, if it was South Korea, it depends a bit on the circumstance in the rest of the world, and those are not good. But if by itself South Korea went nuclear, I don't know if it would trigger a proliferation wave, because I think most non-nuclear states would kind of go, yeah, that's fair. I mean, if I had North Korea if I had North Korea on my border, fine. Like that doesn't mean anything for us. But Iran and Saudi Arabia, right? There are sort of pairings in there. Or now that Pakistan and Saudi Arabia have some kind of defense relationship which has a nuclear dimension to it, which then kind of makes, maybe makes Turkey feel left out. There's some really complex sort of geometries in there that are not easy to predict right now. That said, getting all those bits in place, and they all have to be in place, there are not that many states that have that all at the ready right now. And South Korea and maybe Japan are pretty far, but everybody else still would have a few things to solve.
Is there a would-be European middle power? I ask because...
A would-be middle nuclear power.
Yeah?
Well, Poland is the obvious one,
right.
but not technology-wise, but all the other parts of it, yeah.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
Sorry,
So
guys.
no, yeah.
But they don't have a nuclear reactor in place, and all these things, they don't have the civilian stuff in place yet in a proper way, so... I'll go again there.
So there are lots of ways that make it difficult, but there is perhaps more potential for this arms race taking up again.
Yeah.
And I want to go to a final fragment, because I want to continue the discussion in the direction of like what would happen, or how do we deal with this these escalation ladders that are potentially becoming more and more frequent. Let's have a look at a fragment.
missiles. Petrov told his bosses that the alarm must have been triggered by a system malfunction. Even if something seemed fishy there, he says, do you think I was 100% certain about what I should tell the commander? Of course not. There were doubts. The incident only came to light in the 90s after the collapse of the USSR. Petrov received hundreds of letters of recognition from all over Europe, but he never understood why. He said he had just been doing his job. It emerged this week that Stanislav Petrov had died quietly in his apartment near Moscow in May. He was 77.
Had a response of collective endearment here at the room, but we saw the story of a man who had like 30 minutes, a faulty system, and the judgment to do nothing when he... And that is exactly why I want to talk about now, because that margin of 30 minutes and a human being who's actually part of the process, that was something that made the Cold War nuclear logic very legible to him, but also to us as analysts. So does that still hold in these times where technology and AI and decision-making processes have really changed? So how much of that margin remains? Tim?
Well, overall, I think it's clear that ours is a time of technology accelerating almost every aspect of life, including the conduct of war. If you look at cycles in which sensor-to-shooter cycles, they're called, they no longer take months or weeks, but can be compressed into days, hours, and sometimes mere minutes, as we've seen in Israel, as we've seen in Iran, as we've seen in Ukraine. We also seen the proliferation of sensors everywhere. So the world becomes a digital panopticon in which you can see everything that moves and shoot at everything, everywhere, all at once. That said, the nuclear powers, or at least China, the US, and I think France and the UK joined them, have said we're not going to introduce algorithms or AI in our nuclear command and control structures. One. And two, if it becomes possible to see everything that moves, the question is whether that introduces instability, because you can essentially hit everything, or whether it stabilizes, because you're able to see what your opponent does, and your opponent knows that he sees you. So it's a bit of a mixed answer. There is an acceleration, definitely, but there is also attempts to slow this down. If we now look forward, I am a bit concerned for a variety of reasons. We've just entered the second space age, in which space launch capabilities became much cheaper, and we see the proliferation of satellites. We also see powers building anti-satellite capabilities. And satellites are, of course, important in order to monitor what your opponent is doing. So a destruction of a satellite could be taken as a precursor to a strike. So there's various more sources of instability, both technological and geopolitical, that are springing up, which really necessitates more efforts to control such developments.
Yeah. Paul?
So again, the good news is that you shouldn't expect any of the nuclear armed states anytime soon to have a machine make the choice, right? Which is always the thing you see in newspaper articles and sort of science fiction movies. But that's not but I am worried, and that's the bad news, and that is the incorporation of AI in a lot of other parts of the decision making. So maybe the final decision will stay human, but if you get a lot of other bits that have been, processed by the data analysis, the kind of fusion of the sensor material, all these things have been done already by a machine, and then you might get a suspicion that the other side is attempting something, and you take the final decision, but how much have you really done the homework to figure out if that's actually what's happening? And then there's another problem, and that's sort of also what I think Tim was talking about. So you overall speed up warfare, And yes, the whole world is transparent, but also all our ways of doing warfare depend on seeing things, right? So it's like a bunch of terminology, but just essentially you can imagine it's like there's so many ways to see where something is, then to launch something at it with great precision, to figure out if it's hitting the right thing or if it needs to kind of have another missile hit it. You can do these things. However, whether it's satellites getting taken out or a cyber attack on some kind of communication system or kind of an analysis system, or radars getting blown up, all these things sort of getting out, all of a sudden there are sort of holes in their coverage. Not everything is transparent. There are sort of big things you aren't sure about. And maybe in that big gap where you want to look, that's where the other side keeps part of their nuclear arsenal. All of a sudden you're getting very nervous because you're like, are they doing something with it, right? So in that sense, with warfare speeding up, so while the final decisions are maybe not made by a machine, everything else speeding up, kind of uncertainty and kind of fog of war, right? Sort of the difficulty to see exactly what's happening increases. Then the risk of you jumping the gun, feeling that this is your last chance to use it, or you lose it, those go up. And that's a very different kind of risk.
Yeah, Lisa, because we've the example of like the school in Iran that killed, which was based on AI, which was bad intelligence, but it was going through that thing. So how, even if the final decision is not generated by a language model, like so much in the process leading up to there is what we hear Paul say might be.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that it's absolutely. Like the absolute nightmare scenario is the machine, deciding the target, right? I think you rightly say that is science fiction. I think that's the image of the nuclear bomb as it has survived the post-Cold War in popular culture for a long time. I know there's been some wargaming with AIs, right? Where we've seen these language models or these AIs, if you put them together in a room and you have them, they put them together in a room. See, there you go. It's really hard to
pitch them against each other in a room.
These programs have a penchant to go nuclear, and
not all of them, by the way. But
not all of them, but a lot of them, right?
Right.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah,
yes.
and I think. Weirdly, we speak of nuclear logic and deterrence and deterrent logic as if that were something that you could teach a non-human thing. But there's, we've just seen Mrs. Stanislav's video. There's also an argument to be made of a different kind of logic, which says actually the fact that nuclear weapons haven't been used just hinges on our shared humanity and our shared understanding that we'd be killing all of us off. And I mean, I'm very happy with the nuclear weapon states saying we're not going to introduce that into our command and control systems.
But what does worry me is that Anthropic, what was it, this week or last week, created this new model, Mythos, and it was so smart that they decided not to put it out because it could automatically identify gaps flaws in cybersecurity and cyber defense systems. So they decided deliberately not to bring it out because if it would, all the old infrastructure everywhere, critical infrastructures, would be vulnerable towards disruption and towards being intruded. But mind you, if they don't put it out now, at some point it is going to come out. And then we can talk about striking a deal between the great powers that they are not going to attack each other's critical infrastructures using these sorts of software or algorithms or foundational models. But at some point it's going to proliferate to other actors that are going to do that.
Yeah, because like the introduction of railroads like transformed the Franco-Prussian War, not because the weapons changed, but because all the logistics changed. So will this be like a quantitative change, everything's going faster, or will it really change the nuclear equations?
I'm out of my depth. That's you guys have a much clearer view.
We're all out of our depth, right? We don't know. That's the whole thing. We're trying to create the language, trying to assess, seeing how it works out, sketching pathways, doing war games to see how this may turn out.
But guess what bothers me is, or my intuition is always, it's not really the technology, right? Technology,
Yeah.
we are the problem, right? We're the problem for ourselves, right? We don't need to have these weapons. We don't need to have war. We don't need to have poverty, but we do because we're not really that nice most of the time, unfortunately. But what really worries me with AI, and that you can already see in the way people use AI, is our general propensity for laziness. So we don't really want responsibility. And we like to be in control, feel we're in control, but we don't like the responsibility of it. So, hey Grok, hey ChatGPT, tell me what this actually is. It's an article of 1,000 words, but I don't want to read it. Tell me what it is, right? Now, that's not happening right now, but it's in sort of where these kind of decisions are made. But if that starts, logic creeps into everything, and we're all kind of sort of, taking away a bit of our own sort of homework, our hard work, our responsibility, then at some point, yeah, we're still in control, we're still making decisions, but we're not. So I think it's our intellectual laziness that gets us into trouble here.
Yeah, and do you think that, because we have that nuclear escalation ladder, like when, how do we respond to each other, but also do we still understand each other? Do we still have that ability to signal to each other what's happening and the ability to then be talking in the same language
we don't have enough Russia experts anymore.
I think we
right?
lost
All these
that
other
ability.
things.
Yeah. If you think, look, the whole Cold War, there was a large Slavic department studies in the Netherlands and also in Europe. There were people who had actually studied nuclear strategy, for better or for worse. There were people who understood what Russia was doing. And if you now look in the Netherlands, there's like a handful of nuclear strategists, with two of them sitting at a table, and a journalist who has also studied it, which is fantastic. But that, in effect, created a situation in which the Russians continued to think about nuclear weapons. So they have a thriving community that are both outside and inside the government that think about ways in which you can use nuclear weapons, mix them up with conventional force, how to use them to threaten and to compel, whether successful or not, we can talk about that. But it also meant that as I also said this earlier, that during the first few years of the war, we didn't understand what they were doing. So we need to reintroduce that literacy and create a new generation of scholars, of journalists, of strategists, of politicians, and of citizens that understand this. In order for us, let's go back to the beginning, reintroduce stability in the relationship that we have with Russia and others.
Because this pause that we just saw, that is there still room in the architecture of nuclear security as we have it today, or is that also
I think that those pauses would still be there as long as you have, because his decision. I mean, just to kind of contextualize it a little bit, it's not that he had the decision to go nuclear or not, right? But he interpreted the data and said, look, if the Americans are attacked, if this is, because I think it was, I forgot what the number is, but like the radar told him, the system told him it was like 10 or 12 or something like that. It's like, he's like, that's not likely. If they're going to attack us, they're going to attack us with hundreds, if not thousands of weapons. So 10 or 12 is either an accident or it's not happening. It's a mistake in the machine. Now that's a human kind of knowing the topic well enough to kind of make an assessment and kind of be able to judge the risks of getting it wrong versus, getting this right.
And to have not outsourced the ability to step back and to.
But that's the thing. You can't, you can't turn on your critical thinking. You can't like outsource your critical thinking and then just, 5 minutes before you need to make a decision, you turn it on again. Yeah. That's it's a discipline, like everything else is. And you turn the discipline off, well then, are you really making a decision or a meaningful decision? Probably not.
Actually, that almost had lack of discipline and a lack of sort of like continuous thinking about it. It's not a fun thing to think about, right? We have to... you think in nightmare scenarios, which I think is always difficult. It's always difficult for people to feel that they're prepared for an emergency, because what do you do if it does happen? Netflix last year brought out the film House of Dynamite. And it actually shows you what happens in the pause if the strike is coming. And it's a US control room, and they're the ones that are supposed to be reading, I think, the incoming strike, and they can't believe their eyes of it coming. Right. And then, what's that? Is that is today supposed to be a drill? Shoot, no, today is not supposed to be a drill day. Okay, well then today is an unannounced drill. Well, actually, there's nobody from our side calling us to tell that we did well or not. And then a realization dawns onto people that, okay, well, we're the first 20 people to know that there is a nuclear warhead coming for Washington, D.C. Well, it's going to be here in the next 5 minutes. Your phone is locked at the other compound, so you can't even call your loved ones to tell them to get the hell out of there. There's not enough time. The complete paralysis that befalls these people when the worst does happen, that you're even trained for to recognize, but you don't want to believe your eyes, is something that to err is also human. So that's what the pause can also be. Yeah,
and that does not only apply to nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
I mean, I was thinking of the period prior to the large-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Yeah. And so I have studied interstate crises and how they escalate. And so when I looked at the crisis in April 2021, you had a build-up of forces. In the summer, there was an essay saying Ukraine is ours. In September, October, there was another build-up.
By Putin, yeah.
By Putin in December, he issued a démarche, like a threat, and saying to NATO and to the US, you need to withdraw. And we were having discussions in Europe and in the Netherlands saying, no. We're talking about escalation ladders. No, he's not going to escalate. It would be entirely irrational. So I wanted to reconstruct that. And so like a year ago, maybe 2 years ago, I started interviewing 40 plus advisors to prime ministers and presidents, asking, what did you think? I mean, if someone builds up, issues a threat, puts it in writing, I mean, we shouldn't agree with it, I'm not saying, but then at least recognize... How else to interpret this, right, yeah. Recognize what your opponent is saying, rather than saying, no, he's doing this for nothing. So I mean, the nuclear IQ and the literacy that we're talking about has a broader contextual meaning to sort of raise our geopolitical awareness.
Yes. Well, I think it's time for questions. There's one topic that fell out because of the time, which is the convergence of conventional and nuclear systems. So if you have a question on that, you're also very welcome to ask it. But I want to leave some space for people who have other questions as well. So Senna, you have the microphone. Yes, right, great. So she will come to you if you have a question.
Peter Buys, thank you for organizing this evening to raise all our IQ on nuclear issues. I think it's very, very necessary. Before I put my question about the conventional weapons, I want to remind you to General Butler, the chief in command for 3 years under Clinton of the whole nuclear arsenal in the USA, not a dove, a hawk. When he ended his period, he had a speech saying, I've been 3 years above all these weapons, and I have only one conclusion. We have to get rid of these weapons as soon as possible before it's too late. And that the disaster didn't happen is because of because of military discipline, sheer luck, and divine intervention, he added to it. And I think a lot of military joined him with his statements. And there are other statements too, only mentioning, not explaining, the war game in '83 by the NRC podcast last year. A complete disaster during the Reagan in the Pentagon. Caspar Weinberger organized it, and nobody thought that it would go out of hand in a very short time because of one little nuke on a US base in Germany. Now my question.
Please,
so we need absolutely to get out of this very dangerous situation is to finally find a way to replace nuclear deterrence by non-nuclear conventional deterrence. Aren't we clever enough? And we have developed a lot of weapons that are very precise instead of this monstrous weapon. So what does the panel think about that possible way out?
Mooi. I really appreciate your cri de coeur. And it reminds me of a gentleman whose name was Eddie Cortals Altes, who passed away about 3 or 4 years ago, when he was, I think, 99, and he was a Dutch ambassador for the Queen. I think it was in Spain. And then in the 1980s, he resigned. He put his money where his mouth was because he couldn't reconcile himself with the Dutch position on nuclear weapons. And so shortly before his death, I think it was the late 2010s, he reached out to me saying, Tim, we need to talk because I'm very concerned about this new nuclear era that we live in, and we shouldn't only be focusing on deterrence, we should also be focusing on reversing the logic and at arms control. And I took that to heart, so every time I think about deterrence, I'm going to use your analogy, Lisa, and I'm trying to think of ways to steer the pot the other way around. With that said, in that context of replacing nuclear weapons with conventional weapons, I wrote a piece with a colleague of mine, Davis Allison, we call it Shields and Spears. And here we argue that Europe, were the Americans to leave or were the Americans not to leave, could develop a posture based on deterrence by denial and deterrence by punishment. And deterrence by punishment would be based on a combination of conventional deep precision strike weapons and then still ultimately backed up by the French and the British nuclear weapons. However, in practice, if you look at the deep precision strike programs that we have in Europe, we have a few, but many of them are still in development. We don't have large stockpiles, and many of them take many, many years to complete. Even though in Ukraine, for instance, they have been developing Flamingo, which is an example of a conventional deep precision strike weapon. They're now reportedly replacing the liquid fuel with solid fuel, but the numbers are a bit murky. Do they produce 1 a day? Do they produce 3 a day? How fast do they fly? How precise can they be? So in that transition, which I support, I've actually written about it, Shields and Spears, there is, again, this transitional period in which is going to create more uncertainty and thereby, perhaps, paradoxically, lead to more chances for escalation.
It's also what you said earlier, like we need to be taken seriously in this game by proving that we have something only in order to be able to maybe change the logic, paradoxically.
So just to add, so you need huge amounts of conventional weapons. So I also, I've written about this, argue that to diminish the pressure at least on to kind of lower, or to put kind of the threshold for nuclear weapons pretty far away, rearming conventionally makes it better. That said, I just don't believe in nuclear disarmament because and that sounds, it's a very strange kind of point to make, but the smaller the arsenals get, the higher the chance for nuclear war. Because then there is the chance that you can destroy the other side's arsenal, right? If you're down to 150, 10, there's a point where it's just like, and there's
who's first? Yeah,
and then the incentive to cheat and kind of go, no, I've cut it down to 50, but so you kind of get a situation where everybody gets very nervous, and somebody could defect from that kind of disarmament, and then you have the risk that what if everybody would disarm but Kim Jong-un doesn't or Putin doesn't? Well, that's crappier than a situation we're in now. So you have we don't want nuclear weapons, but we can't get rid of them.
So Lisa, you also studied at King's, just to follow up on this. So I studied science, technology, security,
right.
And our professor Zimmerman was an advisor to Biden back then. And the final term exam was a paper, would you recommend abolishing your nuclear capability or not? And the problem is you, of course, cannot uninvent the bomb. You cannot...
Yeah. It's where we started, right? Yes. It's Pandora's box. Once it's there, it's at least always an option. Yeah. Is there someone else with a question? Yes.
Fascinating as these paradoxes are, I have a question for either one of you, because I think you may have different perspective on that. Is it more important when it comes to deterrence, which is complex, Is it more important for Europe to feel safe when it comes to deterrence, or is it more important that the Russians feel unsafe?
And how much are those corresponding vessels, I would add? Lisa, I want to start with you.
Oh no, I was going to say I need to think
no,
about
Lisa
this
is
one.
thinking.
I don't want to jump. Okay, but I think it's more important. We won't. We
Great
talk.
question.
We
Great
talk a
question.
lot about reassurance. I think it's more important that the Russians are scared. I'm better. I can live better if some of us feel very nervous, but we know that the Russians. Well, I've started using. We need Russian fear, but there's two kinds of fear, right? There's dread and panic. I don't want the Russians to panic for obvious reasons when it comes to nuclear weapons, but I want them to dread that the consequences of aggression against any European NATO member state, whether it's nuclear or not, the consequences will be disastrous for them. And I want them to understand that without panicking, right? So I think actually the fear on the Russian side is the one we're not talking about enough, because to be reassured is almost impossible, right? And there's even this famous statement by the British defense minister that says, and I forgot the exact numbers, but I think it's about 90% of the American effort is to reassure the Allies, about 10% is to really deter the Soviets. Right? So that's probably, and I think we talk too much about reassurance, not enough about deterrence.
So those numbers need to get closer to each other, those percentages.
Well, the point is that you need a lot for everybody to feel safe. But you maybe don't need as much for the Russians to feel scared enough to not do anything we don't want them to do.
Yeah, so you don't necessarily need the escalation, but you do need to predictability.
Yeah, you need to be really clear
on
on what will happen.
So, and I would like to go back to my 3 C's, right? Capability, credibility, and communication. And before we arrive at a level in which there would be nuclear war, we first want the Russians to know that if they would attack us, we would not only have the capability, but also the credibility to the willingness, the resolve to do something. And I don't think the Russians take us very seriously. I also think that based on the past 30 years, they have ample reason not to. But I want to say something more positive. I think we've seen, because of Trump 2 and the developments over the past 16 months, we have seen massive steps and strides in not just European geopolitical awakening, but also determination. And I think the trigger moment was the Greenland incident or crisis, which may flare up again when the threat was no longer material, right? Or you need to boost, or we're going to impose 15% tariffs, but it became existential. You're going to annex a country. And so now, the past couple of weeks, there's news that the Danes, actually, smart as they are, they have really good coercion scholars there, by the way, strategists. They had a little task force, but they were willing to blow up the
airports.
Thank you, the airports. And the much maligned in the English, but also in the Dutch discourse, President Macron actually played a good role there as a president. Said, we're not going to allow this to happen. So and this wasn't even against Putin. This was against Trump. So I see positive developments in this direction. But in order for us to deter the Russians, we should not only think capability, we should also think credibility.
You know what? I'm just going to say thank you, because I think that's a question phrased in a way I hadn't thought about it yet.
Yeah.
And thankfully, I'm not someone that needs to have answers. I get to run with questions. So I don't know. Maybe that's an article. That needs to be written for a public outlet.
And also maybe the Russians feeling unsafe is assuring
There
to
you
us.
go. Like a non-answer to them could be very freaking them out.
See, the sad thing is,
Sorry, we are also on a live stream, so maybe keep it a little bit short, but do keep it in the mic.
Yeah. The sad thing is, 45 years ago, when I was working at SIPRI in Stockholm, the same discussion. So that's why I thought maybe does it actually change, or is this the most important part of the credibility?
Well, I'll
Different context, though, huh?
well,
Same discussion, different context, yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
but I'll say this on this point just very briefly, is that there is a lot of repetition in these discussions, and sometimes it's really it's really, I read stuff from the 70s and 80s, and I think I have a really smart idea, and I go, oh, okay, we already passed that point a while ago. And there's a point here now that it would be good to try to take all these people while they're still around, who did the deterrence in the 70s and 80s, did arms control with the Soviets, and also in the 90s with the Russians, and kind of make sure that all those lessons learned, because there's this 3 decades we sort of stopped caring about this unjustly, that before those people are no longer available, that we really talk to these, because we don't need to relearn all these things from scratch. That would be very stupid. But, humans, but whatever.
Well, we're already interviewing advisors, but also maybe interview retired advisors, I think. So I have time for a last question here at the front.
Well, I happen to have 2, and I hope that's all right. I can be quick about them. So when you go to the Balie website for today's event, there's a line which has the phrase, the declining confidence that the American nuclear umbrella will continue to protect Europe in the future. And I was wondering whether this phrasing may be optimistic in nature, as in, are we confident we're still protected by the American umbrella at this very moment? That was my first question.
Okay, great. I'm not very confident, to say the least. Credibility hinges and communication hinges on leaders that are actually willing to come to your aid, and I think only in the last month or so, Trump has said, Europe, why would we come to their help if they don't help us over Iran? So I'm not confident.
Yeah, I think the word is erosion. Yeah.
Yeah. No, erosion was already happening in a way because of the rise of China, and sort of the US was sort of pivoting with starts and stops to the Pacific, and now, even though it said it was the 4th priority, the Middle East, it still went back to the Middle East. But there's, I think, a larger erosion happening because the US does not have the capabilities that it had before. And Europe, by any stretch of the imagination, is not the natural priority it was during the Cold War, when all the industry that wasn't in the Soviet Union or in the US was in Europe. That's all changed. But yeah, if you have someone who's willing to threaten you, who's willing to kind of say these things out loud, it's really hard to believe that someone will be willing to use, not just come to your aid, but actually go towards these weapons that are insanely destructive. That was a really hard sell. Every American before Trump spent the last 80 years, with the exception of Trump's first term, but selling us the message and selling the Soviets, then the Russians, the message that this was going to happen. And now this is, so I don't think it's, I'm saying declining in public, but this is also public, but I believe it's really not there anymore.
Very fragile, yeah.
Well, I guess I want to end on that not very uplifting note, but I think we've covered enormous amounts of ground today, from the logic, but also to how that holds in this shifting world. And I think we've really enjoyed your expertise, but also made very clear that everyone needs to think about this more, because we need the literacy to tackle these questions for the future. Thank you so much for being here, and I want to invite everyone to join us at the bar. Thank you.